Maybe you've wondered about the question whether the Buddha Gotama, who lived 2,500 years ago, was the only Buddha, or if there were other Buddhas before him, or if there might be other Buddhas after him. This is a question that we can find some answers to, at least some suggestions about, in the early texts, and that's what I'll be discussing on today's video. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org, where you can find courses about early Buddhism, early Buddhist Dharma, that'll help you understand the Dharma better, I hope. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel, and if you click the bell down below, you'll receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So on today's video, what we're going to be looking at is this question of past and future Buddhas. And so what I'm going to do first is to look at the textual evidence in the early texts. We'll be looking at early Buddhist texts for there having been past Buddhas. And then we'll turn to evidence in those same texts for future Buddhas. And we'll see that in both cases, this evidence, while it is definitely there, is historically questionable in various ways. And we'll go through some of that as we go along. Now, as we go along in this discussion today, I think we should keep in mind something that Buddhist scholar Stephen Collins has said. He says that the whole idea of there having been past Buddhas or there being future Buddhas is, as he says, intrinsic to the logic of the Buddhist Dharma. In other words, it's not a surprise that we would find tales of past Buddhas or predictions of future Buddhas. If we think of the Buddhist Dharma, it is that all things change, that all things pass away, and that all things come around again, if you like, in some different degree. And that there are laws of change. That is to say, the Dharma doesn't tell us that all things happen randomly, but rather that all things happen given certain kinds of laws, in particular the laws of dependent origination, which I did a video about. I'll put a link to that down below if you want to know more about that. But there's plenty of, or Four Noble Truths is another thing. I'll put a link down to a video about that as well. So there's certain truths, certain regularities about the universe. And so given that all things go away and all things come back, and there are certain regularities to that, it stands to reason that other people in the past would have known this, would have discovered it for themselves, or that other people in the future might do the same, that the Buddha Dharma might pass away from time to time. Indeed, that's what the Buddha says. It might pass away and be rediscovered, or have been rediscovered many times already. And indeed, in a wonderful early sutta, the Buddha discusses this very possibility when he likens his discovery of the Dharma to a discovery of an ancient city, which has been depopulated and left in ruins. So the Buddha says, suppose a person was walking through a forest. They'd see an ancient path, an ancient route traveled by humans in the past. Following it along, they'd see an ancient city, an ancient capital inhabited by humans in the past. It was lovely, complete with parks, groves, lotus ponds, and embankments. In the same way, I saw an ancient path, an ancient route traveled by fully awakened Buddhas in the past. Now, traditionally in early Buddhism, there are said to be 6 prior Buddhas. That is, 6 Buddhas prior to Gotama, Buddha Gotama, who lived 2,500 years ago. However, in early Buddhism, we really, in most places where these early Buddhas are mentioned, they're not described. They're simply mentioned as a list, basically. There's only one sutta in which anything much is said about them, which is called the Mahapadana Sutta. And parenthetically, this is the sutta that we get the whole story of the 4 sights, the 4 famous sights that the Buddha supposedly saw before leaving the palace. The sight of the sick person and the dead person and the old man and the monastic, the monk. That story is actually given of a prior Buddha, Vipassi, rather than a story about Gotama. And so, and I did an earlier video about that. I'll put it down in the show notes below. However, this idea of there having been 6 prior Buddhas and of the Buddha Gotama being the 7th Buddha is historically questionable. The word that seems to be associated with this idea of the Buddha being the seventh Buddha is the word. It's a word in Pali, isisattama. And isisattama seems to have entered into Buddhism as an epithet, a description of the Buddha himself. It originally meant the ultimate sage, the ultimate rishi being a seer or a sage. And it was brought into Buddhism by, we think, Jain adherents. Jainism is a separate religion that was around before Buddhism. And there were, of course, Jains in the neighborhood, and they became, some of them, converted to Buddhism and brought with them some of the ideas and vocabulary of Jainism. And so they called the Buddha the ultimate sage, or the ultimate seer, isisattama. However, this word isisattama, can also be interpreted or misinterpreted a different way, a sort of a play on words. Instead of meaning ultimate sage or ultimate seer, it means the seventh sage or the seventh seer, depending on how you read the word. It's sort of a play on words here. And this suggests that it may be that this notion of the Buddha being the seventh sage or seventh seer may have come up or been constructed at a later time when the Jain context of that word, isisattama, had been abandoned or misinterpreted, misunderstood. So they thought that they were calling him the seventh sage when actually they were calling him the ultimate sage. That's one possible reading here, one possible historical reconstruction. It may also be that this was sort of a play on words that was understood at the time. Now, the Jain leader at the time, a man named Nataputta, who was sort of a rival of the Buddha during the Buddha's lifetime, was known in his lineage as the 24th leader of the Jains. And as a result, some believe that at a later time in the Buddha Vangsa, which is a later text, a text that was constructed sometime after the Buddha's lifetime, this lineage of prior Buddhas was expanded to 24 as well, so that the Buddha became the 25th. In other words, saying that the Buddha's lineage was longer than Nataputta's. And indeed, later on, in the Buddha Vangsa, in a different chapter, it's even expanded to 28. So the Buddha's lineage over time seems to have expanded. Partly, it may be, or arguably, through competition with Jains, who had already established or understood a long lineage of prior teachers to their current teacher. Now, the great scholar of early Buddhism, Richard Gombrich, has argued that these lists of prior Buddhas were constructed basically to lend credence or weight to the Buddha Dharma. That is to say, that without these lists, there seems to be a lack of tradition. Tradition being one rhetorical strategy that people use to establish the truths of what they're saying. So if the Buddha is saying something that is truly, completely original to him, then there is a certain interest in that, of course, and indeed the Buddha does say that this is original to me, I discovered it. But also it loses something, at least with some of the audience, because some of the audience is going to be interested in knowing that this is a tradition, that there are a lot of people who held this in the past, that there's some reason, it has some weight of tradition behind it. And so in Gombrich's understanding, these lists of prior Buddhas may have been constructed simply as a sort of rhetorical device, again, in competition with people like the Jains. In other words, there may not have been, there wouldn't have had to have been any prior Buddhas, but even if there hadn't been, these lists would have been constructed anyway to lend weight to the Dharma. So now let's turn from past Buddhas to future Buddhas. And indeed, in the early texts, only one future Buddha is mentioned. He's named Metteyya, or some of us may be more familiar with the Mahayana or Sanskrit interpretation of the name, which is Maitreya. These are the same word, it's just one is Pali and one is Sanskrit. And this only occurs in one early sutta, which is the Cakkavattisihanada Sutta. Now, the scholar of early Buddhism, Piatan, who writes a lot on the early texts, a wonderful scholar, considers this text, the Cakkavattisihanada Sutta, to be a late text, This is a text that discusses the wheel-turning king. It's Chakravarti means a wheel-turning king. It's a great king who establishes righteous rulership over the world, or in this case over India, and does things well. And in Pietan's understanding, this may have been a text that was constructed later on during King Ashoka's realm. I have a video about him, I'll put it down below. King Ashoka was an early, the first and most important, we might say, Buddhist king over India, who lived, roughly speaking, a century after the Buddha's lifetime. And Pietan believes that this whole text may be, therefore, a late text coming from that period of time, and it was supposed to be perhaps a way of lending weight to Ashoka's kingship, because basically it was establishing that the kinds of things that Ashoka was doing were righteous, were correct, ruling a kingdom along ethical lines. But even if we don't consider this whole text to be late, it may be that the figure of Metteyya in the text is a late addition. This is sort of what Analio, another scholar of early Buddhism, has suggested. Analio talks about the figure of Metteyya or Maitreya in this text as being out of place. He believes that it was added after the Buddha's lifetime as a kind of an aspirational figure, somebody that we could turn to if we were concerned or worried or sad about the passing of the historical Buddha, Gotama. So after his death, there certainly would have been a lot of hair-pulling, a lot of concern, a lot of worry, a lot of sadness. And having a figure like Metteyya to look forward to might have indeed been something of a spur to a hope, let's say, in the future. And why does Analio think this? Well, Analio says that the one difference about this Metteyya figure in the Chakravarti Sihanada Sutta is that it's the only place in early Buddhism where we have such a definite prediction about the future. We don't in early Buddhism find predictions about the future, because such predictions would, Analio suggests, imply a kind of strong determinism about reality. It would imply that not only were things roughly determined by, let's say, causes and conditions and karmic baggage and karmic background, but that things were strongly determined, such that we could know right now that somebody in certainly hundreds and perhaps thousands of years in the future would be the next Buddha, and we would even know their name. This is the kind of thing that Analio feels runs against the early Buddhist Dharma. It really doesn't fit the way that the Buddha himself would have described the world. He would never have described the world in such strongly deterministic terms. Additionally, Analio points out, in the Agamas, which is the Chinese translation of these early Buddhist texts, they're sort of basically I think we could compare the Pali text against, because they come from a slightly different tradition, but very similar kinds of texts in the main. There is one text in the Chinese Agamas that's not in the Pali material, in which the Buddha has a discussion with one of his disciples, a disciple named Maitreya. And the Buddha in this discussion, in this sutra, says that this disciple Maitreya is going to become the future Buddha Maitreya. In other words, not only is it there's going to be a future Buddha Maitreya, but this Buddha Maitreya is going to be the same person, at least insofar as there is a same person, given a karmic consequence over the lifetimes, the same person as this monastic in front of him. And this, Analio suggests, is a subtle shift towards the early Mahayana. That is to say, that with this kind of sutra, what we're getting is, and I call it a sutra because we're now talking about the Sanskrit northern tradition of Buddhism rather than the Pali southern tradition. The northern tradition eventually did become the Mahayana. The idea here is that we're shifting the aim of our practice from an aim of attaining awakening, which was the early Buddhist idea of our aim towards a grander aim of attaining Buddhahood, of becoming a Buddha ourselves. And this was not an aim that was considered even possible really in the early texts. It was not something that was discussed. The Buddha was the Buddha Gotama, and you weren't going to become him. Later on, however, this did become a possibility, and in this text we see a subtle shift here, where the Buddha is actually revealing this as a possibility to his very own disciples. In other words, he's saying not only that it's a possibility that somebody might attain the same position he has, but that one of them actually will. One of them will be the next one, this monastic named Maitreya. It's really quite a fascinating sutra. And all of this material taken together, I think, implies that there are certain historical questions we have about Maitreya or Maitreya in the early sutras or suttas. It seems to be, or at least has elements that might suggest that it's a later addition, that it wasn't there originally, but that it was put into the text, either that the whole text is late, or that at least this person of Maitreya is a late addition after the Buddha's lifetime. That said, we should keep in mind what I talked about at the beginning here about Stephen Collins's point, which is that the whole idea of past and future Buddhas, even though they may be historically questionable in these cases, the whole idea of them is perfectly natural to the Dharma. We would expect there to be a past Buddhas, or people who realized elements of the Dharma or the whole Dharma in the past and that might do so again in the future. So even though we find these speculative and perhaps not convincing in the early text, at least some of us may not, we certainly shouldn't consider them completely out of place. And indeed, even though we may have our own questions about this, we have to also be careful that we're not bringing back our own tendencies towards considering historical accuracy 2,500 years ago into the past. These certainly were not always intended to be completely historically accurate texts at the time, and may have had their own reasons for being composed. But even if they were not there originally, as we've shown and talked about, there would have been reason to compose them, to put them there for competition, as we've said, with other belief systems such as Jainism, to add a whole idea of a tradition to early Buddhism that was there before the Buddha, that lends weight to the Dharma teaching of the Buddha. And also, it would be useful to add an idea of a future Buddha, as something to aspire to, as perhaps something greater even to aspire to than mere awakening, as it came to be understood later on. Now, this whole history actually does push into the history of the Mahayana, the early Mahayana, and I did an earlier video on the history of the Mahayana, which I'll put up here on the screen, and I would suggest taking a look at it. Might be interesting to you. It's really quite a fascinating early history. Hope this has been fun, and hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. And meanwhile, be well.